This is the final lecture for the class, and I'll entitle it The Culture Wars, Plato, Shakespeare, Shakespeare's Tempest, and then Hermann Hesse Glass Bead Game, and a couple of quotes from T.S. Eliot's The Rock to bookend the lecture. So let me start with a quote from Eliot's The Rock. He says, "The world turns and the world changes, but one thing does not change. In all of my years, one thing does not change. However you disguise it, this thing does not change, the perpetual struggle of good and evil." So, what I'd like to look at briefly is that struggle between good and evil. And even though things do change, and they seem to change, the ongoing issue of good and evil, often defined differently, but nonetheless, that struggle ever goes on between how people understand the good and the distortions of the good and the consequences of that for the human soul, and for families, for communities, for societies, for nations, and the world itself. So let me start with Plato's The Cave, Book 7 of the Republic. Very important to note that what Plato is doing in the cave, he's drawing from Homer's work, the Odyssey, in which Odysseus and the sailors go into the cave of the Cyclops, Polyphemus. And what, of course, happens is Cyclops is a one eyed creature of the giants. And what you have is Odysseus and the crew are hungry, literally hungry. At a deeper level, one could argue hungry for meaning, hungry for purpose. They've been distracted on their journey back to Ithaca from the Trojan War. And so their hunger makes them desperate. Now, in the culture wars that we live in, inevitably people's hunger for meaning, to belong to a group, often what it eventually creates is a believing in a certain interpretation of a hot button issue in the culture wars that often distorts the bigger reality. So, what we get on the progressive side is a certain prioritizing of the issues, a certain interpretation of how you prioritize those issues, and then you get the reaction of the conservative right arguing for free speech. Now, inevitably, what happens, these are all Cyclops type figures, and when a person goes into that cave, the rock is rolled across, and one is expected to obediently accept a certain prioritizing of issues and how those issues are interpreted. Fast forward to Plato's cave, moving from Homer's cave of the Cyclops, which is one dimensional interpretation of complex and layered issues, as Plato uses the analogy in Book 7 of the cave of people living in a cave. Behind them is a fire, and from there, what you have is shadows that are dancing off the wall, and you have a pantomime figure who plays with shadows and makes the shadows look like reality. And throughout that cave, you have various people playing with shadows, making the shadows look like reality, and people become very committed to the shadow dance. But in different parts of the cave, there's different shadows, different configurations the shadows take. And people in the cave inevitably dispute, differ, polarize on which shadow is the one that's the most important, which is the one that one should abide by, find the most compelling, the most attractive, the most convincing. And inevitably in the cave, people go to battle over whose version of the shadow is the most reliable and is not. Now, the philosopher, at a certain point, interesting chains is used in this. You'll get this in Rousseau, you'll get this in Marx, is that people are chained to a chair, not realizing behind them people are playing games with interpreting reality, of which the shadows on the wall seem to be the moving and dynamic interpretation in this sense. The philosopher finally, through a variety of thinking and insight and reflections, comes to see that there perhaps is more to reality than the cyclopean one dimensional read of the hot button issues in the culture wars. And so the philosopher gradually finds their way out of the cave, the world of shadows. They discover the blue sky, a day scar, the sun, warmth. Then the danger then, of course, is that the philosopher just heads off and leaves the world of the cave behind. That's one way of approaching the role of philosophy. is that the thinker inevitably leaves the world of time and history behind and enters the world of pure ideas. This is where, for example, Aristophanes in The Clouds, the great Greek comedian, will mock Socrates in The Clouds as someone who floats in the clouds. Now, of course, he's dealing with the younger Socrates, the Socrates who was not engaging important thinking with public responsibility and dealing with the polis and the difficult issues of justice and peacemaking and philosophy and theology. Socrates inevitably moves beyond his portrayal of Aristophanes in The Clouds, and he becomes a much more engaged public figure, raising very substantive ethical issues for people in the soul and society. But Socrates, if we can use Plato's understanding of him, the mature Socrates goes back into the cave. Inevitably, when you go back into the cave and people are committed to the shadow world that they live in, the cyclopean interpretation of the ideas, and someone comes back saying there is a blue sky, there is a fuller understanding of reality, inevitably, because there is no experience of that, then the philosopher is maligned, the philosopher is attacked, the philosopher is told that they're silly, they're foolish, that their ideas have no relevance for the world of the city. And so the philosopher at that point, the thinker at that point, can retreat and just leave the cave, because taking the position, why waste my time on people who do not want to think? Or the philosopher, out of charity, out of goodness, remains in the cave, attempting to persuade, attempting to articulate, attempting to be with people and convince them that there is more to reality than a simplistic cyclopean read of the difficult ethical, political, economic issues of the time. What happens inevitably to the person who dares to think, then they're mistreated, misunderstood, and in Socrates' case, the hemlock is taken. This, of course, is the great warning of any people who are grappling with the relationship of philosophy and the polis, philosophy and public responsibility, philosophy and citizenship. One temptation is just to leave it behind, um, because people are not going to listen. People have a tendency either to put their head in the sand and ignore the big issues, or they become very addicted to one-dimensional reads of difficult issues rather than recognizing, both in history and in the contemporary sense, issues are far more complicated than often they seem when people beat the drums of one tune on an issue. And so you get in Plato's cave then a using of the Cyclopean tradition, and recognizing that often a great deal of thinking is very simplistic. It slips into cliches, but it does not deal with the more thoughtful way of interpreting reality. And this is why you get the split between what are called the progressives today, with their interpretation of issues, either historically or contemporary, and you get the reactionary conservatives with their interpretation. And so if things were as simple as 1 and 1 equals 2, the issues would not be contested. And so this is why you get in a lot of Plato's, their dialogues, a certain level of hermeneutical, what we call generosity is at work, and humility is called for. Let me now fast forward from the use of the cave in Homer and then in Plato to The Tempest, considered Shakespeare's final great play, a tragicomedy in many ways. The key figure in this is Prospero. Prospero is the Duke of Milan. He gives himself as a young man to philosophy, to the point in which, in thinking these important issues, he ignores what it means to rule in the kingdom of Milan. And his brother Antonio takes over, much to initially Prospero being unaware of this, because he's so buried in his work of thinking and reading and studying that he's not aware of what's happening actually in Milan and the taking over of the city-states of Milan. He feels his brother has betrayed him, Antonio, because what Antonio does, he brings together a bunch of men at night, and he essentially, if he'd followed Machiavelli's lead, he probably would have killed his brother, brother being a threat to the ruling of Milan, but he banishes Prospero and his daughter Miranda to an island. Prospero spends a decade on the island with Miranda, And it's through this period of time, Prospero educates Miranda. Here's a very early form, obviously, Shakespeare holding high the education of women at the highest level. Miranda is given the best education from her father. Her father is also very competent as a magician. And as a result of his power, and this is where we get the clash in the Tempest, life being a tempest, life being a struggle, similar to the Greek agon, life is a struggle. Prospero has to deal with the tempest of what he sees as betrayal by his brother, but did he contribute to that betrayal for not taking responsibility as a political thinker and linking together thinking and action, philosophy and political responsibility? Um, and he's torn inevitably because Prospero grows in power, so you get this tension in the tempest between power and wisdom, between prudence and those who can use their abilities to silence others through power. So he conjures up a great storm, which brings together those who betrayed him onto the island. And as the tempest unfolds, inevitably you get Prospero, who has been betrayed, anger, bitterness, vindictiveness. These are all attitudes which are at the heart of Prospero because he has lived in exile for many years. And he feels those who have been the closest and nearest to him have taken advantage of him. And so Prospero has to deal with a variety of issues. He could use his power to mistreat, to kill those who betrayed him, or he has to grow in terms of a deeper attitude of forgiveness of those who have taken advantage of him. And as the tempest comes to an end, it's the story of Prospero's education, not in terms of power, not in terms of reading books, not in terms of scholarly ability, but in terms of a change of attitude, a change of how he understands those who have betrayed him. And so as the play comes to an end, he has to face many a tempest, and the play itself ends with some, of course, not being aware of what's going on, some of those who betrayed him, but he will not punish them. He will not use power to take advantage of them. And so he throws his magical skills aside. He leaves his books behind. Um, Eventually, Miranda and Ferdinand come together. A very different ending, obviously, than the tragedy of Romeo and Juliet. It's a very, very different story. But the story of Prospero is very much the tale of being betrayed, having go into the cave where those who had betrayed him had forced him to go to the island, but he becomes a different person as a result of the betrayals, the difficulties, and not becoming bitter and angry as a result of it. He returns then to Milan to rule as a wiser and a deeper person. For on the one hand, his naivety about philosophy that's disengaged with political responsibility, but also dealing with the tempest in his own soul in terms of where bitterness and anger and vindictiveness and using Machiavelli tendency towards power for those who threaten you. Don't necessarily treat them kindly because they will take advantage of you. So he lets go of power uh, and he realizes forgiveness is the way forward. And as a result of that, he returns a sadder but a wiser person, to use Coleridge's reflections in the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. Third one then is, in that sense, Hermann Hesse's Glass-Bead game, in which you have a community of intellectuals, the Castalians, who emerge after cultural decadence has set in, cultural superficiality, illiteracy, people turning on one another in terms of how they make sense of difficult issues of their time. And so these Castalians emerge as the intellectual elite, similar in many ways to Plato's guardian class. But they're somewhat distant, just as Prospero was in his early years of Milan, from the hurly-burly of life in the valley. And so the leader of the Castalians, Magister Ludi, or Joseph Connect, fascinating, you get two words here. Connect is a German word for servant. And Joseph, in the biblical story, was one who'd been betrayed by his brothers. And as a result of betrayal, his tendency could have been, again, to destroy them when they finally came to Egypt. But again, just as Prospero did, he learned forgiveness. And as a result of that, his family became unified once again over the long journey. So Joseph's journey, he becomes a leading figure in pharaonic Egyptian life. Prospero returns. to Milan to rule. And so these are positive stories in one sense. But what Hess has done in the glass bead game is he turns to the valley, to the demands of political life and political responsibility. He drowns in a lake. So what Hess does, he leaves this open in terms of when a person is engaged in the hard issues, will they will the story remain positively, a comedic ending, or will it remain tragic? Socrates comes to a sad end. You get the great Hebrew prophet Jeremiah, the longest book in the Hebrew canon, the most confessional of all prophetic writers. Again, he goes from one sad thing to another, not listened to, not heard, yet always grappling with speaking the truth in the midst of injustice. Um, and yet his story is not as happy or pleasant an ending, in that sense, a comedic ending. So you get this story when people grapple with the issues of good and evil, the consequences. People can deal with a change of heart. Does that mean the consequences will be positive? Not necessarily so, but there are stories where they end well. And so when you get in Plato, the story, how well was Plato listened to as he was thinking through philosophically all these large issues for the city? Certainly his teacher Socrates did not end well. Jeremiah, who I mentioned, certainly not an easy journey. Jesus is crucified. Um, in the situation with Shakespeare, who it's a comedy, even though it's a tragicomedy, Prospero, it ends well. With someone like Hermann Hesse in the Glass Bead Game, it he, the future is open. So, in terms of, yes, the master of the Castilians dies, but he, to some degree, has he passed on the wisdom and the insights of Castilian thinking and wisdom, and how cities should be governed. And it's up to the new generation to pick up that torch and carry it forward. Let me again finish then with the reading from T.S. Eliot's The Rock. The world turns and the world changes, but one thing does not change. In all of my years, one thing does not change. However you disguise it, this thing does not change the perpetual struggle of good and evil. And in all of these great works of literature, and particularly in the culture wars we live with at the present time, you get people contesting the notion of good and evil, and who defines the good and who defines the evil. And often in the culture wars, sadly so, you'll get the progressives see themselves as the good and the conservatives as the evil. The conservatives see themselves as the good and the progressives as the evil. This simplistic polarization that goes on could certainly be transcended, and the tribalism and the clannishness that people find themselves in, if they were immersed a little more in the writings of a T.S. Eliot, a Plato, Shakespeare's Tempest, and of course Hermann Hesse's The Glass Bead Game.